So everybody knows the resource development in Alberta and actually in British Columbia as well, and most of North America is changing. Horizontal wells are commonplace, and we're working in reservoirs that used to be avoided or ignored. They're very challenging, technically challenging reservoirs, and hydraulic fracturing has now become commonplace, multi-stage hydraulic fracturing, and I think that's why a lot of you are here today. So what are unconventional gas reservoirs or unconventional tight oil reservoirs? They're reservoirs that have very low permeability, so gas and fluids don't want to move through those rocks, and that's why hydraulic fracturing is used. So we talk about shale gas or tight oil, tight gas, and you can see here on the left, extremely tight, what we refer to as tight, very low permeability reservoirs. Those are the kinds of resources that are being developed for the most part today. Conventional reservoirs over on the right. From a geological perspective, in the subsurface, all rocks, not just reservoirs, oil and gas reservoirs, all rocks are subject to three stresses. A vertical stress, which is pretty straightforward. People understand that. It's just the weight of the overlying rocks, essentially. And then two horizontal stresses. The objective of hydraulic fracturing is to create enough pressure to overcome the weakest of those stresses. And that's how fractures are created in the rocks, by injecting fluids, whether they're gases or liquids. It's not a new technique. It's been used for 50 or 60 years. It has continued to evolve through that time, and it will continue to evolve in the coming years and the coming decades. This is just a picture of the first hydraulic fracturing operation in Oklahoma in 1949. Horizontal wells have gotten longer over the last decade. Now, in some areas in the far north of northeastern British Columbia and the Horn River area, they're now drilling horizontal wells that are 3,500 meters long. Down in the Bakken area in North Dakota, it's not uncommon for there to be horizontal wells that are 8,000 or 9,000 feet long. So similar kinds of lengths. So the most common fluid that's used to increase the pressure in the shale reservoir or the tight sand reservoir is water. There are other fluids used. Nitrogen has been used. Carbon dioxide has been used. Propane has been used. Oil has been used. And it's really the reservoir rocks that determine what the most appropriate fluid is. Here in Alberta, most but not all, most of the plays that are being pursued by oil and gas producers are using a water-based fluid, sometimes with some nitrogen or some carbon dioxide in it, and small amounts of chemicals to mainly to prevent interaction of the fluids with the chemicals that are in the rocks. First, the photo here is of a very large, extremely large hydraulic fracturing operation in northeastern British Columbia. Trican, that's courtesy of Trican. Some of you are probably familiar with their equipment in this part of the world. So you see a mix in that photograph of water tanks, pumping tanks, sand, storage trucks, and a whole bunch of other things. There's a chemical van in there, cube van for chemicals. The other thing that we often forget about is that these hydraulic fracturing operations are monitored very closely from what's referred to as a data van. It's a very high-tech operation. The volumes, the rates, the fluids, the rates that chemicals are being added, the pressures, those are all monitored on an ongoing basis, and the operator of the hydraulic fracturing operation can abort the operation in the event that there are any anomalies showing up. You're probably familiar with this or something like this. The hydraulic fracturing operations are typically about 99% water and sand, and typically less than 1% chemicals. And the chemicals are familiar to many of you. They include things like surfactants, potassium chloride, a variety of acids and bases that adjust the pH, some chemicals that prevent bacterial growth, and a friction reducer to, believe it or not, reduce the friction of the water in the pipe. When you're moving water long distances, there's a fairly large friction effect. The normal routine practice, and in fact the regulated practice in most parts of the world, but not all, unfortunately, is to ensure isolation of groundwater, isolation of aquifers, and isolation of the producing zone through steel casing and cement. And these practices continue to evolve and get more sophisticated as the industry evolves. There has been a lot of concern that hydraulic fracturing operations will break through from a shale or a tight sand into a shallow groundwater. In fact, there have been thousands, by now probably tens of thousands of fracturing operations that have been observed using sensitive seismic monitoring instruments, and in no cases does the maximum vertical growth of hydraulic fractures come anywhere near shallow groundwater. In this graph, so the depth, first of all, is in feet on the left-hand side, and what you see here is a presentation of hundreds, actually in this instance it's thousands of hydraulic fracturing operations, and you can see the maximum growth of the fractures from the deep point of initiation of the fracture, and the blue bars at the top show the maximum depth of usable groundwater. And in this case, I don't think there's anywhere where the maximum fracture growth comes within more than about 3,500, comes within less than about 3,500 feet of groundwater. These kinds of graphs have been built, and these kinds of observations have been made in most of the shale basins in the United States. A lot of the data is not public, but these graphs are available for 4 or 5 different shale basins in the United States. I'm not aware of anything like this that is being prepared for Western Canadian operations. Fluid volumes, the key point to take away is that the amount of water that's needed depends on a bunch of things, including the rock characteristics, the depth, the length of the horizontal well. So longer wells will take more water, but there is a corresponding reduction in the amount of surface disturbance because there are less wells required. Shale gas operations, typically water volumes for fracturing might be 10,000 to 50,000 cubic meters. Tight oil operations, 1,500 cubic meters to 4,000 cubic meters. And again, it depends very much on where you are, the amount of water that's required. There is no rule of thumb. It's a reservoir-specific or a site-specific requirement, and different operators have different approaches. Just to show you some pictures that you may have seen similar things. The upper right is water storage at a shell operation at Groundbirch. They're in the process, that's in Northeast BC, they're in the process of filling those water storage impoundments. On the bottom left, Talisman, another large volume water storage impoundment. You can see the liner in that one quite clearly. And on the lower right, picture of a temporary water line. Not sure of the location for that one. And that's to avoid truck traffic by using temporary water lines to move water around in the field. Another example here, above ground fluid storage. I think this is again in northeastern British Columbia. Two big storage reservoirs there. I think one has flowback water in it. The other one has base water. So how much flowback do you get? Well, you get, depends on where you are, again. But typically it would be in the 10% of the water, in the range of 10% of the water that's injected as a part of the fracturing operation to 50% of the water. But it can vary a lot. So I just wanted to make a couple of remarks on the trends that we're seeing happening. There are aggressive, I refer to them as aggressive moves by the fracturing companies to develop chemicals. They call them green chemicals. The objective that most of them have is to get food quality or food grade additives that do the things that are needed to the fluids. There are places where deep salt water is being used to reduce the amount of surface water that's required. And you may be familiar with the city of Dawson Creek and the arrangement that it has with Shell, where Shell is going to use wastewater, community wastewater, to complement its other water sources for its hydraulic fracturing operations. We're also seeing a lot of work going into developing what I call less water intensive fracturing fluids. So those are fluids that would use more nitrogen or more carbon dioxide and less water to accomplish the fracturing operations. This multi-stage hydraulic fracturing has really taken the oil and gas industry and the public by storm over the last decade, and there's actually been a lot of work done in North America to address some of the public concerns and to take a hard look at history, take a hard look at operations, and see what the actual risks look like. I will refer you to the Groundwater Protection Council. It's a U.S. non-governmental organization, and they've done a number of publications. Just one that I reference here. They looked at about 300,000 wells in Texas and Ohio, and the contamination incidents that were associated with that. Different time frames there. You can see. But the keys there were, from their research, the keys were that none were related to hydraulic fracturing in those two states. And in fact, some other work has shown that none is related to hydraulic fracturing anywhere, which is not to say there are no incidents. The incidents that have been observed had to do with the way waste fluids in particular were being stored prior to the 90s in particular. In unlined pits, and that's a practice that has pretty much been stopped around the world. It's certainly not a normal industry practice, and it's not allowed in Alberta. The other main source of groundwater contamination was, in fact, from surface storage leaks, spills from vehicles, spills from pipelines, leaks from facilities. Those were that was the primary risk area. There's a lot of work going on related to independent assessments. There's recognition that regulations do need to be strong. They do need to address the risk areas. And so there's an organization in the United States, another nonprofit called Stronger, State Review of Oil and Natural Gas Environmental Regulations. And they are going from state to state reviewing the regulatory environment that governs oil and gas, upstream oil and gas operations, and making recommendations to how regulations could be strengthened in each of those jurisdictions. And for the most part, I would say the reading I've done would suggest that from an occupational health, safety, and environmental perspective, most states are happy to have that feedback and implement the recommendations from that group. So there's certainly a strong awareness of how the industry's operations have changed, how the risk areas have changed, and how the impacts have changed. And there's a lot of work going on the regulatory side around the world to address that. There's also we're seeing a trend in operator practices, a lot more, I'll call it introspection, a lot more thinking about their operations and how they can do them better, and a lot more transparency, much of it voluntary, and in some cases complemented, as you'll see from the first couple of bullets. Some cases their voluntary efforts are complemented by regulatory requirements. Much of the concern about the additives that are used in hydraulic fracturing fluids is being addressed by voluntary disclosure and by regulatory disclosure. So British Columbia has implemented a regulatory requirement for disclosure, and I believe Bob can probably comment on it. It's in the regulatory pipeline here in Alberta, and will be a regulation in the coming months. Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has done a lot of work with their members to come up with a set of operating practices for responsible development, and those span a great deal of the hydraulic fracturing related activities that producers undertake. And I heartily recommend, if you're not familiar with them, go to CAP's website and have a look at the practices that its members are subscribed to. I guess my closing point would be we're in fact very fortunate in Alberta and British Columbia. We've got world-class regulators here. They are consulted routinely by other jurisdictions, whether it's Quebec or New Brunswick or West Virginia or Bulgaria or Argentina or Poland or Mexico, and in fact we should be proud of the work that is done in Western Canada to ensure that the regulatory environment for operations is meeting the public's needs and ensuring a path for responsible development. Thank you. What I always try to close by saying, don't lose sight of the fact that the operations are intrusive, but they are also transient. And so I put, this is from the pump jack is from a tight oil site in the Lock End area, and the lower flight is the lower slide is a multi-stage, a multi-well pad producing gas in northern British Columbia from a shale gas operation. Thank you, and I hope I didn't go too long over.